Hello, everybody. My name is Anne Marie Hunter, and I am the director of Safe Haven's Interfaith Partnership Against Domestic Violence and Elder Abuse. I'm also a United Methodist pastor and delighted to be with you all today. Happy Pride Month to everyone, and this is the perfect webinar to be doing during Pride Month. I think it's a wonderful way to celebrate. So with me today from Safe Havens are also Allison Morse-Katzman and Corrine Sigmund. So welcome to them as well. And thank you to NCJ-FCJ, who's providing us the platform, and also to our wonderful sign interpreters. We really appreciate that. Next slide, please. We are funded, this project is funded by the Office on Violence Against Women at the Department of Justice, and we're also very grateful to them for the funding to provide you with these webinars. Yeah, thank you. So we have next slide, please. We have a really wonderful webinar for you today, and it's my honor to introduce our presenter. Nancy Nienhuis has a doctorate from Harvard Divinity School in Religion, Gender, and Culture, and she served as the Dean of Campus Life, Vice President of Operations, and Professor of Theology and Social Justice at Andover Newton Theological School for many years. And she taught courses on social justice and also on intimate partner violence. There are so few courses on intimate partner violence in any form in seminary. So it's really special and wonderful that Dr. Nienhuis provided one of those courses. I think there were only 20 countrywide, so real groundbreaking work. She has an interest in issues of intimate partner violence and sexual assault, and particularly as those issues intersect with the training of clergy, which of course survivors are also saying to clergy, please get trained. So that it's an important work. Her book, she has many articles, and her book is entitled Saintly Women, Medieval Saints, Modern Women, and Intimate Partner Violence. And she explores theological responses to domestic violence in medieval times in the lives of saints, and compares that with contemporary responses to such violence that's happening now from faith communities. And she co-authored that book with Professor Beverly Main Kinsley at Harvard Divinity School. So it's a really great book, and I recommend it to you. So from 2009 to 2011, Nancy served on the Violence Against Women Act Faith-Based Committee for the U.S. Department of Justice, Office on Violence Against Women. And also recently, she was invited by the Carter Center for Human Rights to write a piece for an annotated version of the UN Declaration for Human Rights that will be distributed around the world to give religious leaders tools to argue from their religious traditions against gender-based violence. So she's doing fabulous work on so many levels. She's also currently an adjunct professor at Boston University School of Theology currently. And I would just say personally, Nancy is fabulous. And if you want an ally, this is the person you should reach out to because she's amazing. So Nancy, thank you so much. We're so grateful that you're here with us, and I can't wait to learn from you.
Oh, thanks, Anne Marie. That was a lovely introduction, and it's my privilege to be here. I'm so excited that so many of you have chosen to join us for this webinar. We are looking forward to having more conversations with people who are interested in this topic, because a lot of times people don't put together support of LGBTQ plus the community for victims in that community and survivors, and those survivors' religious beliefs or spiritual practices. So I'm really happy to be here. Just FYI, I'm going to be using this LGBTQ plus acronym to mean all the communities that would be included in a much longer set of letters, which would be something like LGBTQQIAA, which would encompass lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, two-spirit, queer, questioning, intersex, ally, pangender, genderqueer, bigender, gender variant, and many more. So we use this as kind of an umbrella term, and sometimes you'll hear the community called the queer community, or sometimes the rainbow community. It kind of depends on where you are in the country and what community within a city or state you're in, because these terms are always evolving and new terms are being added as people come to new understandings of themselves. It's really important to ask someone with whom you're working how they wish to be referred to. What pronouns do they use, if any, so that you can support them in a way that feels right for them. Okay. Anne-Marie first shared this image with me, and I just love it. So why is this topic even important? Regardless of the religious community, there are LGBTQ plus members. Those members are there because their beliefs are important to them. Their spiritual practices are important to them. But a lot of faith communities have been happy to pretend that we weren't in the congregation. Religious communities may approach the GLBTQ plus members a lot like this illustration. They ignore them or don't see them at all or don't want to see them. This is also a good image for a conversation about abuse and violence in LGBTQ plus communities. Too many of us have had to pretend that violence in our lives doesn't exist, particularly since we're often facing discrimination and a lack of understanding from the public. This happens all the more for LGBTQ plus people who are disabled or people of color. Before we get going, let's do a little poll. What do you hope to learn this afternoon? And when you think about serving the LGBTQ plus survivors of faith, what questions or concerns do you have? Please write them in the chat box so that I can take a look and my colleagues can look. And I am. Okay. So for some reason, I am not seeing the chat. So perhaps Anne-Marie, or you could share some of the questions that are coming up if you can see it.
Yes, I certainly will. Right now, we just have a question about the recording, and we've just tried to respond, although I'm not sure that it's going to all the participants, that the recording will be up on the Safe Havens website as soon as I can. Oh, here we go, to panelists and attendees. Yeah. So well, Sandra Price is saying avoiding terminology that might offend.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And again, that's why I suggest so much that you ask people how they refer to themselves in their community. Because
and Beth,
then you know.
There's a couple other responses here too. Beth Gagnon is saying, I hope I'm saying your name right, Beth. Sorry. I hope to learn about how to help do prevention work within this intersectionality.
Great.
And someone else is saying how to approach faith with LGBTQ plus survivors in a way that doesn't imply judgment. Okay. Kristen says, thank you. I'd love to know some affirming scriptures or passages. Okay. And someone whose last name I think is Davis is saying how to approach with sensitivity, and I'm not sure how to approach survivors of faith. Okay, great. Well, these are among the things we're going to cover this afternoon. So there will be a time for questions at the end of the webinar. So if I haven't answered your questions or you have further questions, you'll have a chance to raise them again or change them in whatever way works for you. Okay, so I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit because we're going to talk, as I said, we're going to talk about many of those questions that you've raised. But let me give you an overview of where we're going
in this webinar. I'm going to cover 4 areas. I'm going to talk about who is in this community of GLBTQ+, what their lives are like, the prevalence of intimate partner violence or domestic violence in LGBTQ+ communities, the role of spirituality and or religious belief play that the role it plays in the lives of these survivors, and how you can best support them. So I think we're going to cover pretty much what your interests and questions are. And, you know, as more people have questions, please go ahead and raise them. Okay, so who is this community? You can't know a community unlike your own as well as, you know, I can't know another community as well as I know my own community, but I can learn as much as I possibly can about that other community. I can gain insight that way about perhaps what they may have been through, who they are, what their specific needs could be. And all of this is going to help me support LGBTQ+ survivors better. So we need to know about the experience. We need to know the particular ways that intimate partner violence affects LGBTQ+ lives. And we need to know what support has to take into consideration in order that we serve this community, my community, well. So the first thing that is kind of a no-brainer is that LGBTQ+ life is different. I mean, we can be harassed, assaulted, or killed if we do pretty minor things. Hold hands in public, hug in a restaurant, take an Uber or taxi, and be obviously who we are. Act to LGBTQ+. You know, have you ever thought about how you act to heterosexual? But there are lines, you know, some people, as long as I don't see you, I'm okay. But if I see you, you are in trouble. Date in high school or college. My previous work was as the Associate Dean of Students for graduate students at Simmons University here in Boston. And, you know, they have a vibrant female college, women identified, gender identified college or university. And, you know, I watched those college students date and all the things they did. And I thought, oh my gosh, would I have had fun in college if I had been able to do that? I would have been thrown out, certainly. But if I could have dated and just been who I was, that would have been amazing. Of course, I'm not sure I would have completed my degree. I think I might have had too much fun. So, you know, maybe it's just as well. That harassment or assault can happen if we try to join a religious community, try to adopt a child, go to a movie, seek help for intimate partner violence from agencies that heterosexuals might go to without thinking that they're going to be rejected as who they are. So if we do any of these things, we're subject to harassment. Might be sworn at, stared at, shoved, or worse. And I've experienced all of those things. You just never know when it will happen, but you always know it can happen. And of course, this list could be a much longer list. LGBTQ+ survivors of color face even greater challenges. They're more subject to harassment or abuse when they seek help. They often face discrimination from the police, or worse, as we know too well. They're not given the same medical or mental health care as whites receive. And this is documented over and over and over again in studies, that they're not offered the same medicine, the same procedures that a white person would access. And they may face racism from within the LGBTQ+ communities. Just because I'm in that community doesn't mean that I, as a white person, have done my homework around racism and other issues. So there's an additional layer that happens with people of color in the LGBTQ plus community. It's always critical to hear voices from within these communities with which we work. And here are three that I thought I'd raise up for you. In high school, I had girlfriends, but we had to be very secretive. We were worried that our family and school lives would implode if found out. Or another, when we bought our first home in a new neighborhood, we worried, would people egg our home? This did happen. Or poison our dog. Thankfully, this did not. In driving across country to visit relatives, we wondered if we were in an accident and one of us was injured, would the other one be able to visit us in the hospital, be considered family? Now, certain states have laws around this. We have some national protections that we haven't had before, but it still depends on where you are, because, some part of a big city, some part of a rural area might be that sort that will impose their own ideas about what should or shouldn't happen. And you can hear voices inside LGBTQ plus life by watching films from that community, by reading books that talk about that community. There are a lot of ways that you can get some insights into what life is like for those of us who are in this community. A bottom line, though, is that whoever you're supporting in the LGBTQ plus community, we're incredibly diverse. We come from all racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, and religious backgrounds, so there's no one size fits all. And respect is critical when working with any of the survivors in the LGBTQ plus community, because in some areas we get so little of it that having respect is going to have a huge impression about whether or not we're going to be accepted in a community that we might seek help from. So how common is violence, either intimate partner violence or domestic violence, in LGBTQ plus communities? Let's take a look. So for sexual minority women, this comes from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, which is, I'll shorten to NISVS. This came out of the Center for Disease Control, the CDC. And this study found that 44% of lesbians and 61% of bisexual women experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. And this was compared to 35% overall of heterosexual women in this study. It also found that 46% of bisexual women reported rape, compared to this is just rape now, compared to 17% of heterosexual women and 13% of lesbians. The CDC study found that 89.5% of bisexual women reported heterosexual male perpetrators of the intimate partner violence, physical violence, rape, and or stalking that they reported. The rest were female. So their perpetrators were overwhelmingly male, but not all male. Almost a third of lesbians who have experienced such incidents reported that they'd had one or more heterosexual male perpetrators. For many of us in the lesbian community, especially those of us who are a little older, we dated men on our way to feeling that we could come out fully as lesbians and have that kind of long-term relationship. Sometimes we were trying to figure out how to make ourselves right as the community and culture defined right. And so and there are a lot of times when, unfortunately, some men will see lesbians and think, and I've heard men say this, just give me one night with her, I'll change her. I mean, it's ridiculous. If he spent one night with a man, would he become gay? But I digress. This is the world that we have. For sexual minority men, as compared to heterosexual men, and I want to say that this is also from the CDC NISBS study, unless I've noted it somewhere. Bisexual men experience the most intimate partner violence. Bisexual men report intimate partner violence least often. So, working with somebody who is male and bisexual, for those of you who are advocates and service providers, just understand that they have probably had so much violence in their lives and yet been very unlikely to repeat it. Let's face it, in some groups of men, reporting that one was bisexual could be very dangerous. In other groups, the men would rally around them and support them and be the friends they are. But you certainly can't count on that. And you don't actually know until you come out. So it's a big risk. Gay men are less likely to report intimate partner violence than their straight male peers. And I've read at least one study that talked about how straight males are more likely to report intimate partner violence than some of these other groups. One might not think of that, but it's actually true. 26.9% of gay men have had intimate partner violence in their lifetime, so about 27%. And in this survey, 12% had had it in the previous year. Gay and bisexual men have experienced twice as much sexual violence as other than rape as heterosexual men have experienced. And in the same study, 40% of gay men and 47% of bisexual men had experienced other violence as opposed to rape, compared to 21% of heterosexual men. And remember that these webinars are recorded, so you'll be able to go back to the Safe Haven site and review all of this data. And at the end of the slideshow, I have a couple of slides on sources I used and other sources that are really excellent. And so I encourage you to go back to the slides so that you can see these reports or look them up for yourself. Although more limited in number, studies of the trans community suggest that they confront similar, if not higher, levels of intimate partner violence. Now, the United States did a trans study in 2015, and the data I'm sharing comes from that study. If you go on to the government site and you look at the places like the CDC, you're going to find some of probably the biggest studies on LGBTQ plus life, because they do these studies, and the data is there. So that's another way to get a handle on what's going on in the community. And even if you're part of this community, I may know more about lesbians than I know about trans men, for example. So I still have to do my homework. You don't learn it just by being. So these studies, for example, this one in 2015, found that intimate partner violence in the trans community ranged from 31% to 50%. Now they were reviewing studies, and they were doing their own survey. So that's a broad range. The lifetime prevalence seemed to be around 31.1%. This is a different study. Lifetime intimate partner sexual assault in the trans community, this is back to the larger survey, was anywhere from 25 to 47%, depending on the study. So again, you can see that in different communities, you're going to get different rates of return on the percentage of violence. Among trans people of color, the picture is even more dire. For American Indian trans community, it's 65% of intimate partner violence. For multiracial trans communities, 59%. For Middle Eastern trans communities, 58%. And for Black trans communities, 53%. We can all agree that these percentage points are far, far, far too high. Violence in all communities increased in the pandemic, and I'm sure that you know that. No, there was no escape from abusers. Abusers were home more often because they weren't going into work. Shelters and other services were shut down. Victims were unable to flee to family or friends due to infection risks, and courts were closed. And as a result of these and other factors, we're seeing more violence, and worldwide we're seeing much more murdering of women and traumatic brain injury. So femicide and TBI, traumatic brain injury, around the world has increased a great deal. In the July 2020 issue of the Harvard Health News, Dr. Eva Valera wrote, with abusive partners home more frequently due to lack of social outlets and or loss of employment or working from home, it may be impossible or more dangerous for women, she's writing about women, to find a safe space or time to seek help. The closing of courts has made it more difficult, if not impossible, to obtain orders of protection. Consequently, some who have been planning to leave are no longer able to carry out that plan. And we know that it takes a great deal of time for someone to come to a point where they will risk developing a plan to leave. So to then be able to be unable to carry that through is devastating. So here are some of the tactics of violence that sexual minority communities experience and have in common with tactics in heterosexual relationships. So there's physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological violence and abuse. That's all the same across relationships. Where intimate partner violence is concerned, the abuse increases in severity over time. Power and control, that's it. That's the base of that's the key theme here. That is how you distinguish an intimate partner violence relationship from one which is not. One party is doing everything they can to control the other party, to have power over the other party so that other party does exactly what they want them to do. They share a risk, heterosexual and LGBTQ plus communities share a risk of intimate partner violence in adolescence. Abuse is equally severe in both communities, and victims in both communities may feel great shame. Let's stop here a minute and do another quick poll. If these are some of the tactics of violence that are similar in the experience of violence that are similar across heterosexual relationships and those in the LGBTQ plus relationships, domestic violence, intimate partner violence situations, what might be different? What might be particularly relevant? A type of abuse that's particularly relevant in LGBTQ plus situations, intimate partner violence situations. So please Go ahead and put
Beth
your
is saying-
answers in the poll.
Oh,
Go ahead.
they're on it. They're on it,
Okay,
Nancy.
good.
Beth is saying threatening to out you.
Yep.
Mercedes is saying threatening to out their partners. And Beth added control. No, sorry, this is Rami. Control through threats of outing.
Yes.
It says threatening to out someone or disclose their HIV status.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, let me, this is really good. Here are some of the differences that I thought of, and if we all worked on this together, we'd come up with many more.
And there's one more,
sure.
Nancy, can I read it just because I think it's important?
Please.
If their partner identifies as trans, refusing to help with doctor's appointments or medicine.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
Really, really powerful. And think of what, if someone has started the process, think about what that would mean.
Carl added, close-knit LGBTQ plus community means leaving a relationship might mean losing a lot of friends.
Yes, excellent. Very good.
They're on it.
Yes, I'll have to add those to my my ongoing list. So you were all over threatening the partner and that being part of power and control. There's also just the overall stress that LGBTQ plus people experience due to the discrimination we face. Like that list a while back of not being able to do basic things unless we are willing to risk assault or somebody ruining your day by swearing at you or whatever it is. We carry that stress into any relationship because that's part of being in the community. And so when you have that stress added to the stress of being in an intimate partner violence situation, it just makes it more difficult to cope day to day and get through day to day. LGBTQ populations experience higher levels of shame about who they are than do about the violence than do LGBT, than do heterosexual survivors. They too feel shame, but in our population, and we can think of why, all the messages that we've received in society, or if we're religious or spiritual reminded, have a faith belief, we might have heard those messages in our religious groups. And so we have a higher level of that shame. And shame can elicit, at least two defense mechanisms. One could be an attack on the self, where you're saying you're kind of internalizing that those messages and talking to yourself about how no good you are, which can lead to depression. And another is an attack on another, where you might be violent towards someone else as part of just, you can't take it anymore. It's just too much. There are worries that shelters will be biased, so people may not go into shelters, hold off going in because they worry about how they'll be received. They fear the police won't respond, and often police don't respond in the same way or believe the victim and take action. They may not report intimate partner violence for fear of hanging out the dirty laundry in the community. And what this means is, the larger community in which I live may already be sending me messages despite some federal laws now and other things that protect us to a degree of protection that generations before could not have even imagined. There are still people who will say all these negative things about the LGBTQ plus community. And if I say I'm in a relationship of violence, it's sort of like underscoring what they always thought about us anyway. Oh, see, that's the kind of relationships that people in the LGBTQ plus community have. It just shows how evil, damaged, unnatural, pick your word, that group is. And there's another fear, another difference that, somebody who's heterosexual doesn't walk into a shelter or talk to a social worker who's working with some kind of community center and be afraid that somehow being heterosexual is going to mean that that provider might discriminate against them. But someone in the LGBTQ plus community can very well have that fear, and probably most of us do when walking into a place that serves providers, that where service providers are unknown to us or not in or from our communities. So let's move to some myths about this group of LGBTQ plus communities. You know, one is men are never victims. So a gay male in a violent relationship, that just doesn't compute because men aren't victims. Women are never perpetrators. So they may not think that violence in a lesbian relationship is that bad. Or they may never think, you know, that a heterosexual woman could be violent to a heterosexual man. And of course that happens too. There's this myth of mutual battering, that if they're both women or they're both men, then they're kind of evenly matched and no one person is going to have control over the other. So it's not the same thing. It's not as bad as intimate partner violence in heterosexual relationships. And of course, that's not true. And abuse in same-sex relationships is not as severe. All of those are myths. So these myths trivialize and discount intimate partner violence that occurs in the LGBTQ plus community. Now, before I show you the next slide, this next slide has examples of violence from within that have occurred in the LGBTQ plus community. And so I want to just warn you, and any of this material that we're going through could be hard to hear. I usually say this at the beginning of a presentation, and I didn't today, so I apologize for that. You know, what I want you to do first and foremost is take care of yourself. You know, if this is getting difficult, you know, back away. The seminar will be there the webinar will be there on the Safe Haven site. You can always watch it later and at a pace that's comfortable for you. So first and foremost, take care of yourself and do what you need to do to support yourself. So this slide follows up on the idea that the incidents, the violence between so-called equals can't be that bad. We can go to service providers and some of those, because of this myth of equality and the violence between equals, some service providers might think it can't be so bad or not as urgent as responding to heterosexual intimate partner violence survivors. But these are all things that have happened in the LGBTQ plus in intimate partner violence relationships. Feet hammered on, an arm wrenched out of a socket, hitting the side of the head with a brick, blows to the head with a shovel, gunshot wounds, broken ribs, even being forced to nail on glass. As I said, you know, people are as creative in their methods of violence in the LGBTQ plus community as they are in the heterosexual community. The violence that's listed here was reported to staff at the Domestic Violence Legal Advocacy Project. You can see that on the screen at the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Center. This slide captures some of what we've been talking about, plus a little bit more. There's fear that abuse will not be taken seriously because it's in the LGBTQ plus relationship. We talked about that. There's the fear of re-victimization by law enforcement, criminal justice, and social service workers based on one's identity. There's a fear of being outed to friends, family, employers, employees. You all got that. And there's also a fear that the abuser will convince people that they're the victim. So if the police show up to a house and both members of the household are male or female, and that's the relationship, the abuser may say very convincingly that I'm the one that was beat up. And sometimes they are more convincing than the actual victim, because when you've been in an intimate partner violence relationship, it destroys your self-esteem and can get you to the point where you really don't believe you're capable of anything. A friend of mine told me, if I had been told by my abuser that the coffee cup sitting on the counter wasn't actually there and I was imagining it, I would have believed it. I was so beaten down. And so the person who is abused just may not have the wherewithal, the words to explain what's been happening. And they may fear, even with the police there, that saying something will result in retaliation by the person who's abusive. So this is something that can and does happen with, unfortunately, too much frequency. Let's turn now to religious survivors in LGBTQ plus communities. Intimate partner violence occurs in every single religious tradition, and there are LGBTQ plus people in every religious tradition. So generally speaking, the numbers of survivors in the LGBTQ plus who are in a religious tradition or spiritual tradition and outside of that religious or spiritual tradition is going to be the same. Religion, religious belief itself does not prevent one from experiencing intimate partner violence. In one study in the United Church of Christ, a Protestant religious organization, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 10 men inside the church experienced intimate partner violence, which is very similar to many studies done by people on women and men, heterosexual women and men outside the community. So that's just one indicator. So let's do another quick poll, and I'm sure you're going to be all over this as well. So before we move into the area of religion survivors and LGBTQ plus community, have you worked with LGBTQ plus survivors of faith? Or if you're willing to disclose, are you a survivor of faith? If you worked with an LGBTQ plus survivor of faith, have they raised concerns about their religious beliefs and the intimate partner violence that they're experiencing? Share whatever you would like to about this, and Anne-Marie will let me know what you're thinking. And maybe this isn't applicable to who we have in the room right now, and that's fine too. Okay. Well, hearing none, let's move on. And later on, if something came to mind for you, please go ahead and enter it into the chat box.
Nancy, I think I would just mention something that I hear all the time from survivors who are faithful, and that's the issue of forgiveness. And I think that goes even beyond the Christian community, although I know it's also centered on the Christian community, but I think there's other faith traditions that also struggle with forgiveness at the intersection of abuse and faith.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Um, yeah, that idea, especially in Protestant religious communities, that there are all kinds of sayings about forgiveness and how important it is to forgive, and
Hmm.
that Jesus said that one must forgive the neighbor 7 times 7 times, as an idea that you forgive and forgive and forgive.
Hmm.
But many of those texts, as you know all too well, require forgiveness without justice. And I think, and I dare say that Jesus would agree that if someone is treating you this way, then that violence has to stop for you to be able to be in a place where you can forgive the person. Because otherwise, you may not know yourself or realize yourself that the hope of being somewhere else is coercing you into a forgiveness that you can't fully feel because you're not fully safe. So thank you for bringing that up, Anne Marie. We could talk a lot longer about that.
Yeah. There's another response here, Nancy, from Nora, who's saying that she worked with a trans survivor of faith. Nora, I'm sorry, I'm not sure that's your pronoun. I'll say they worked with a trans survivor of faith. She was concerned about how a faith-based organization would respond to her, how God felt about her, and all of the abuse she endured. And she would ask, why would God let that happen to me?
You're right on the money, Nora, and we're going to talk about many of those things in the next few slides. So that rings so true for what the actual experience is of people from the LGBTQ plus community, and what some of their fears are when it comes to getting help from people within their religious or spiritual communities. So let's talk a little bit about those things. I'm going to walk you through how various traditions can be roadblocks or resources to LGBTQ plus survivors of intimate partner violence. So let's talk first about religion as roadblock. What many religious traditions have in common are teachings from sacred texts and from within the religious tradition itself that view GLBTQ plus individuals as deeply flawed, as unnatural, as even immoral because of our sexual identity. So although communities within each tradition can be very diverse, in many, the harm done to GLBTQ plus individuals begins with rejections they've experienced in that community, either in the present or in the past. Sometimes we will be accepted if we remain celibate. But of course, then we cannot step into our full humanity. And we can't be fully a part of that religious community that we hold so dear. We have to choose between faith and belief and being in a relationship with someone we might love. As for GLBTQ plus survivors, a potential source of refuge and safety is the religious community. But that may already be out of reach because of who that survivor is. Even in a religious community that accepts us, and they exist in every religious tradition, I assure you, LGBTQ plus religious communities members may not admit intimate partner violence for fear of being stereotyped as immoral, because religious communities, at least some in those, already think they know who we are. Survivors, are often raised in religious homes. In fact, it's still the case that most people have some kind of religious belief or identity. I think, Anne Marie and Allison, it was some slides that you had in a previous webinar that talked about a 2020 survey that found that 64% of millennials held some kind of spiritual or religious belief. And those percentages got higher the older someone was. So it's still very common. And of course, the person, not of course, but often their partner, the abusive partner, is also somebody who has been raised with certain religious teachings. It's also true that when we're in crisis, we often turn to faith, religious belief. We hope the religious traditions we're in will be helpful, and yet teachings and traditions that are cultural traditions within the religious group are so often used against us. And I'll go further into what some of those are. So intimate partner violence in this set of intersections is a crisis that's physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual. And one of the people that really put meat on the bone of the spiritual aspect of the crisis is Reverend Dr. Anne Marie Fortune, who's worked with, is now retired, but probably spent 30 years or more working on the intersection between survivors and religious belief and faith. For myself, I was a dean of students in universities where I also taught on this subject. We're often in theological schools. And one of my students told me that she stopped believing in God because, and one of you said this in one of your posts in the chat box, she said, I stopped believing in God because why would God let little children like us get beaten? And she was in the LGBTQ plus community, but this was something that still lived with her. And she had been given, her stepmom hit her so hard that in the head, that she required 23 stitches. And she and her siblings were viciously abused by this stepmother. And the Sunday school teacher, she learned in church, that God loves children. So why would God not intervene? Another student of mine said that a Sunday school teacher told her that God watches over those who love him, using the male pronoun for God. And she at the time had been getting abused by 2 boys in her neighborhood, and that had been lasting for over 2 years. And so she figured if she was being harmed and not protected, God wasn't watching over her. And so God must not love her. So despite these really negative experiences that some LGBTQ plus survivors have had, they may have rejected their religious beliefs as a result of these. And the 2 people that I mentioned both did reject their religious beliefs despite their experiences. Yet when they were later in intimate partner violence relationships, they yearned for having that community to support them. They really want to be able to be supported like they were. So religious roadblocks that LGBTQ people face, I mentioned a couple in the examples that I gave before, and fear of rejection by the religious community if they're outed through domestic violence, intimate partner violence, shame, new shame, that if they go to the community as they are, it'll be like it was before. They'll be they feel shame as they approach a religious community that reminds them of how they were shamed previously. Years of hearing messages discrediting your sexual being, that's a roadblock too, that you have to get through if you're going to go back to a religious group and hope for a different result. And there's also an internalization of a tradition's homophobia or transphobia or what have you. You can't hear all those messages and have them just wash off your back. And the earlier you hear them and the longer you know that they're there, the more impact they have on you. Another roadblock could come from clergy. LGBTQ plus individuals may and have received life-threatening advice from clergy, like pray harder and the abuse will stop, or try to get your spouse or partner to go to a religious service, as though somehow that will magically end the abuse, or just give the abuse over to your higher power, or that higher being that you see in your life, or to God or Allah, or that you are actually being punished by that higher being because of who you are. All of these things go through the minds of survivors. More negative
I was
impact.
muted. Nancy, there's a comment in this chat. If
Sure.
you have a moment, I'll read it.
Sure.
I would just like to clarify that God does not create that to happen. Abuse is not a creation of God, and it is so unhealthy to believe that a loving God wants that to happen. Those children should have been supported and have had those concepts explained to them.
Amen. Absolutely, that's true. And so many churches now have gotten training, not nearly, it's a drop in the bucket, I'm sorry to say, but through organizations like Safe Havens, more and more religious communities and spiritual communities are getting training for the leader and the staff, so that fewer children hear that kind of horrible response later on. There is no religious tradition that teaches that their higher being or their sense of a higher self is responsible for the harm done in intimate partner violence or domestic violence relationships. Even the most conservative, well, there are probably some in the more conservative organizations that would say God is using the violence as a way to teach you to be something else. But there are good possibilities too. But this is basically going to what you just said: belief that God or Allah, or however you refer to a holy one, allowed the violence, intimate partner violence, or in the case of the children, the domestic violence, to happen, or purposely didn't step in and help the survivor when God could have. There can be feelings of abandonment by God or the Holy One, with resulting fear and mistrust. If I was abandoned once, why should I pray or seek enlightenment or do anything else if I could be abandoned again? There could be a belief that God is punishing me for being LGBTQ plus. I've spent whole nights praying to God to change. I did that in college because I thought I couldn't be if I was lesbian. That those two things, living and being lesbian, could not go together because of the Christian beliefs I had. And so that kind of belief can be very common. And so religion can silence the survivor and blame them for the abuse instead of holding the abuser accountable. And that's a key thing that religious communities can do. And I'm getting into that a little bit more soon, holding the abuser accountable. Now, these are powerful feelings, and they can have a significant impact on the survivor's decision to access help or remain silent. This is particularly true if these messages are coming from an abusive partner, which often happens. They'll use that victim's own beliefs and turn them against them. Victims have been told by abusers, see, God doesn't love you, God doesn't care about you, or this wouldn't be happening. It's also terrible when these messages come from a religious leader in the tradition. So here are some messages that I'm going to share that have come from religious leaders. many prohibit let's see, I'm a little bit mixed up here. Okay, so although this is Catholicism, although a particular inclination of the homosexual person is not a sin, so the inclination to be homosexual is not a sin, it's a more or less strong tendency ordered toward an intrinsic moral evil. And thus the inclination itself must be seen as an objective disorder. So if I even have the inclination, I've said it's not a sin, but it means that I have an objective disorder. This is in the Catholic Catechism. Religion as roadblock to safety in Orthodox Judaism. And there's a whole webinar on Judaism and IPV, so I encourage you to see that for more information. But the Human Rights Campaign website, another great source of information, found that Orthodox Judaism may prohibit sexual relationships between individuals of same gender and base gender roles on birth biology. So that means the whole trans community is just out of luck. There is an emphasis on the binary gender and strict separation between men and women as defined by Orthodox Judaism. In Islam, most imams are trained in culturally conservative non-US schools. And in fact, before a few years ago, when a school for imams opened in Boston, there really was no such school in the United States. I think there was one program out in California, but it wasn't a complete training for imams. Immigrants who may be maybe from Islamic communities, they could come from countries where LGBTQ plus people are punished by death. And they're going to bring those ideas with them and think that that's part of Islam, even if they meet American Muslims who don't hold that belief. LGBTQ plus people may fear being ostracized from mosques and community centers. And we know that already our Muslim communities are under great discrimination all the time and have all kinds of things being done to them just as Muslims, just because they're Muslims. And so the community centers, the mosques, provide a robust, supportive life experience for American Muslims. And LGBTQ plus Muslims may fear being ostracized from certain mosques or community centers if they come out as who they are. And they're just not going to risk losing the only supportive community they really have. And that community might blame the intimate partner violence on their identity. There is a correlation between Islamic belief and anti-gay sentiment. In a 2014 Pew Research Center study, they found that Muslim Americans were less accepting of gay and lesbian people than Americans as a whole. 47% of US Muslims said it should be discouraged. 45% said it should be accepted. Now, in recent days, that number of how the 45% of Muslims saying gay and lesbian should be accepted has risen to 52%. So in a very short period of time, that sentiment has gone up significantly. But Muslims were not the religious group that was most disapproving of gay and lesbians and other in the LGBTQ plus community. Evangelical Christians, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Mormons oppose gays and lesbians and in terms of who they are by larger margins than Muslims oppose gay and lesbians for being who they are. Okay, there are many texts that talk specifically or about the that are correlated specifically to harm done to the people in intimate partner violence relationships. And there is a book from the Faith Trust Institute based in Seattle. This was Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune. She was a co-founder of that center, the person I mentioned earlier. And that book, Walking Together, is specifically written for advocates who want to know more about the role religious belief plays in intimate partner violence victims and survivors. So that book, which I just looked, is on sale now for $12, usually like $30, but that book is meticulous in going, and it's written by people who are coming out of the communities that they're describing. So there are different kinds of Christian communities highlighted. There are Jewish communities, Muslim communities, Buddhist communities, Catholic communities. And so for specific texts within those communities that do great harm to the safety of intimate partner violence survivors, I highly recommend it. Now, it's not talking about LGBTQ plus survivors, but LGBTQ plus survivors are going to experience all that their heterosexual survivor sisters and brothers are experiencing and more. So I see it as a very valuable resource. Okay, let's talk about religious belief as asset, because it truly is a huge asset. The bisexual person I quoted before, who left the church because she wanted to be a pastor and was told that she couldn't be if she was bisexual, found a church that would accept her. And she told me, I found a church that would accept me as I am. And that has been truly life affirming. Every religious tradition has life affirming resources for LGBTQ plus individuals. And for, so Judaism, this 2016 statement from the conservative branch of the Rabbinical Assembly, they passed a historic resolution in 2016 on affirming the rights of trans and non-conforming people, affirming its commitment to the full welcome, acceptance, and inclusion of people of all gender identities in Jewish life and general society. And today, the web pages of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, the largest group of Jewish individuals in the United States, says each of us, created in God's image, has a unique talent with which we can contribute to the high moral purpose of tikkun olam, the repair of our world. Excluding anyone from our community lessens our chance of achieving this goal of a more perfect world. And there are also many Protestant religious denominations that are affirming to LGBTQ plus people, and in almost all of them, there are LGBTQ plus leaders. They are the ministers, the religious leaders. There are over 5,000 Protestant churches that are welcoming and affirming in the United States, and that number goes up every day. And this statement from the U.S. Committee, the U.S. Bishops Coalition. I'm trying to. They don't call themselves that. I'm just blank for a minute of the name there. But they said, as bishops, we condemn the use of any Bible to support abusive behavior in any form. A correct reading of Scripture leads people to an understanding of the equal dignity of men and women, and to relationships based on mutuality and love. that's, that's great in terms of taking a stand on intimate partner violence, but it's a very narrow stand. And, it could be talking there of only heterosexual men and women and not the rest of us in the LGBTQ plus community. So sometimes it's one step forward and two steps back, or one step forward and one step back. Resources, to continue with resources, I am quoting various verses in the Quran. Marriage should be based on mutual love and compassion for the purpose of mutual tranquility. Communication should be positive between individuals. Mocking and name-calling is simply prohibited. From Zen Buddhism, in the third precept, the expectation is not to harm, exploit, or manipulate others. And there are webinar series from within these different traditions on how violence intersects. And the way violence intersects is going to be similar for LGBTQ plus people. We're going to experience all that heterosexual survivors would be experiencing and then some. But those webinars would help you understand what's happening within that particular organization. And I should say that Zen Buddhism does not make a distinction between same-sex and opposite-sex relationships. So they have this expectation instead that people should be living together peacefully. Okay, now, I've
Nancy,
said, yes,
could I just bust in one more time?
sure.
Lena has said, Tikkun Olam is something that advocates can use to help dispel myths that Judaism supports DV/IPV as well. When abusers misuse Jewish scriptures to defend their abuse, Tikkun Olam is a core belief of Judaism, saying we should all be striving to repair the world, and we clearly can't be doing that if we're causing harm.
Excellent. Thank you
Thank
so
you, Lena.
much for that statement. Very something that we all can learn from and keep in mind.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a positive aspect of Judaism that can be used to fight intimate partner violence and to help survivors feel that they have a right to be safe. There are studies in the field of social work that and others that demonstrate beyond a doubt that the actual religious belief that survivors hold has a positive impact on them. So in this one study I've put here, improved self-esteem, self-efficacy, and life satisfaction were found in survivors of or victims of faith or religious belief. And in fact, they found more of that in those survivors than they did in survivors who didn't have that aspect of their lives to lean on and get support from. This second study found that religious belief was very effective in coping with the distress of the symptoms of trauma, PTSD-like symptoms specifically. So the religious belief helped people get through those PTSD symptoms and manage those symptoms because of the support and other options for support that were provided by the religious community, so that they actually could see a reduction in PTSD symptoms among those who could rely on and seek help from their spiritual and religious traditions. And then this third study found that religious belief was an effective way of coping with distress in the aftermath of trauma. So the religious belief provided a greater social network, connections to other people and to God or that higher power. This was a study specifically focused on African American women, but surely this would be transferable to other survivors as well, for whom faith and religious belief is very important. It can be a healing source of strength and identity. When religious groups support LGBTQ plus community members, we get a love and acceptance of our particular identity from that group, which doesn't often happen, except for within our own group. When we're with each other, we can get a sense of purpose and deeper meaning. We can feel the compassion and empathy and openness that those in that religious community have to us, which is grounded in our identity instead of despite our identity. This support can provide us with a passion to live out our spiritual values, to reconnect with something that can ameliorate PTSD symptoms, for example. The religious community provides positive relations with others that are so important when we've had such a negative experience in the intimate partner violence situation itself. And it can provide strength and resilience to survivors in the face of the discrimination that we all receive all too often. So that's the religious community, community itself. But when the religious leaders of those communities are helpful, their role can also be incredibly important in specific ways. When clergy treat LGBTQ plus survivors with care and compassion, our psychological and emotional outcomes for recovery are much better. We heal faster when we have the support of our religious leaders. Now, that's really an incredible thing to say. And so I'm going to repeat it. When clergy treat us with care and compassion, we actually heal faster from abuse we may have experienced. That's how important messages from those leaders can be to LGBTQ plus survivors of faith. And clergy can also be, and this is so important, critical resources for those who abuse. In fact, in one study, they found that for those who abuse, they are much more likely to go to a batterer intervention program if a clergy person or religious leader advocates for them to go and encourages them to go than they are when the courts mandate. They're much more likely to show up if one of you who are leaders mandate or ask or say, you know, part of our healing together is requiring you to do this. They're much more likely to show up when religious leaders ask, as opposed to the court. And of course, the court can put them in jail, but you know, that's how critical religious leaders can be. And beyond that, when religious leaders and the courts, if the courts require and religious leaders affirm that requirement to someone who abuses, they're more likely not only to show up for a batterer intervention program, they're much more likely to stay in that program and complete the program. Now, that's an incredibly powerful thing. And it shows the role that clergy, religious leaders, spiritual advisors can play in stopping abuse. Because we know that those who abuse are usually serial abusers. They didn't abuse just in this relationship. There's a whole long line of bodies behind them who were abused by this person. And if they don't change, there's going to be a whole long line ahead of them that they'll abuse. So religious leaders can be critical. Religious communities can be critical when it comes to holding abusers accountable and creating safety around that particular abusive person. That's an investment we make in the future. So, the bottom line is that most religious leaders are well, some are helpful, some are not. So basically what we're saying is that religious traditions are a mixed bag. They can be helpful, but they can be unhelpful. They're not all good, they're not all bad. And here's a really unique example of that sort of being mixed bags. In 1998, Western Islamic scholars declared that gender reassignment surgery was acceptable. 1998. That's early, my friends. It was acceptable. People are born transgender, they said. So they must decide which gender is correct. However, like in contrast, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, others chose homosexuality or choose to be in a relationship other than homosexuality, and that choice is a sin. So you can't be in a same-sex or other than heterosexual relationship. That's a sin. But if you're born trans, that's not a sin. You just have to decide which gender is correct, and then off you go. I think that's amazing. So it's rare that an LGBTQ plus Muslim would feel welcome in a mosque, and they may not want to jeopardize that, as I said earlier. And this is even though over half of American Muslims agree on a recent poll that society should approve of homosexuality. And that is going up. But again, there's hope, because more recently, Western Islamic scholars are revisiting these kinds of pronouncements, these kinds of beliefs. They are starting to question those beliefs and look back at the theology for something else that might be there that's more affirming of people in the LGBTQ plus community. And I certainly welcome that. So, the implication for those of you in the webinar that are advocates, you can't assume that religiosity will mitigate adverse effects of trauma for all survivors, but it can for many in the GLBTQ plus community. Given the research, and this is a quote from a research study, it's imperative for clinicians to integrate a focus on religion and spirituality into service. If your survivors can access religious traditions that provide those kinds of clear, positive results, then you want to do all you can to help survivors of faith to be able to access those services. You have to be aware that belief is this mixed bag with positive and negative effects. They can be powerful supporters and help those who abuse to be responsible. This is why it's so important for advocates and survivors to listen to those who are in the LGBTQ plus community. You can't know without listening what kind of religious support they may have access to or may not have access to. You'll have to ask them if religious beliefs are important, or if you can't ask because of federal laws, then if they mention that, or you can ask them questions about, what other resources are in your community or in your life that might be powerful and helpful for you. You might be able to say that some of my clients have found religious belief or spiritual belief really powerful. I don't know if that's true for you. So you can ask leading questions, or maybe you can't, depending on where you are, but you might be able to ask questions that allow a survivor to see you, think you might be one of those people who could be acceptable about religious beliefs. Because a lot of people have left shelters because their religious beliefs were not honored. And so if an LGBTQ plus survivor of faith thinks that you are open to their faith, they're going to disclose that to you. And then you can help support them in getting the kind of wonderful results they might get from a religious community. So what advocates can do: learn about the reality of our lives, educate yourself, listen carefully to what survivors say, respect their beliefs, and understand that religion can be a critical resource. You can partner with religious leaders who affirm LGBTQ plus individuals, have coffee or tea, collaborate to keep survivors safe and to hold those who abuse accountable, offer to train religious groups on how to respond to intimate partner violence in LGBTQ plus communities. Now, we've had some conversations and questions asked. I hope that I've answered many of those questions. I'll show you. There are a couple slides of resources here. I don't know if we have even a moment for anyone else to put questions in the chat box. Probably not. I think we've gone quite long. So let me turn it over to Allison Morse-Katzman. Again, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Allison, I know you have some announcements about an upcoming
Nancy,
webinar.
thank you for that wealth of information. I will be sending out the slide deck, so you'll have all the resources that Nancy's referring to, and you can go back and look at her citations as well. I can't thank you enough. We are so honored to have you on our team, and really so much information. I just want to thank you all for participating today. I also want to invite you to participate in our upcoming and our last webinar for advocates, which is coming up on June 24th. This will be our last in our series for advocates, and we would love to have you with us. Supporting African American Survivors of Faith will be presented by Ayanna Wallace at Ujima. I will be sending you an evaluation along with the slide deck. So please do take a moment to complete it. It really helps us. And I think, Nancy, if you can forward the last slide for me, I think it has our Safe Haven staff contact information. Don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have questions or concerns, or you want to share successes or troubleshoot. That's what we're here for. I want to thank everyone, and thank you to NCJ, FCJ, and to the interpreters. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, and take care. Happy Pride Month.
Happy Pride Month.